Howdy, friends. Welcome back to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Andy Vance in Minneapolis, Minnesota for the Midwest Poultry Convention. Big gathering of growers from the broiler, layer, turkey segments, and all of the allied industries that comprise the poultry industry. In addition to a big trade show, there's a number of educational sessions here for folks in the industry. One of the speakers joining us, Paul Goeringer, who's on faculty at the University of Maryland, an attorney by trade, and helping producers navigate some of the sticky legal issues that we might find ourselves in. Paul, your presentation at the convention dealt with strategies producers could employ to maybe stay out of the legal crosshairs, as it were. Would you give us an overview of what you shared with attendees?
Yeah, so a lot of what we talked about today was sort of working initially as the operation to develop practices that you want to operate by. It's stuff you're doing every day. How do I go about, putting that down into words, developing these guidelines so whoever's working on the farm, whether it be you, a kid, hired hands, whoever it might be, they understand the rules, they know how stuff's being done, and make that conform a lot with the permits and other legal requirements you may have, because if you're a large grower operation, you probably have some permits you got to comply with, and sort of taking that into consideration. So in the end, we can develop a record that everything's being done properly on the farm, and it will help some of the litigation that's going to arise down the road. And then a lot of it is just putting that into practice, making sure if people screw up, you talk to them about how they screw up, they discipline them properly. And if it's a kid, you actually discipline them and don't just write it off as, junior being junior. You actually take care of the problem and make sure the operation stays out of trouble. And then a lot of the other stuff we talked about was looking at how do I understand what a right to farm law is. A lot of producers don't understand how right to farm laws operate and how they can protect the operation. So we talked a lot about that and kind of took some examples and where they could find other examples of their state's right to farm law, depending on where they're at.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, your area of study, as I looked over your CV, you've had quite a wide range of different topics, and as you alluded to, things that producers might find themselves dealing with range the gamut from simple compliance issues to environmental, employment. You talked about employees there. Where do you find generally, if you were going to say walk through any poultry operation in America, where do you find the areas where maybe across the industry we're most vulnerable to exposure liability?
I think a lot of it is with the hired hands maybe not understanding everything, them coming on and us thinking they know what they're supposed to be doing, and they may not have the background in it. I gave a presentation one time where we talked about how most of the people coming in to work on farms today have no ag background, which is really different than where it was years ago, where people grew up on farms, they started working on farms. So a lot of it is we just don't take the time to train the employees properly because we don't have enough time to do it ourselves. So now we're throwing people out and hoping they can figure it out with the good old on-the-job training that may not be the best for some of these larger scale operations. For small scale operation, it may work really well, but for these large scale ones, it's somewhere you need to take the time to sort of get them trained up. And there's extension programs they can go to, other systems they can work through to sort of get that sense of what they should be doing.
Getting a good onboarding process, it can't be understated, because when you're talking about all of those different potential areas of exposure, on-the-job training maybe is not the best practice.
No, because in my experience, from my own experience growing up on a farm, on-the-job training just meant I screwed up a lot. And then there was a lot of me in conversations with Dad explaining to me how I screwed up. So yeah, onboarding is really important to where we can get them started right, and maybe we don't start them out, throw them to the wolves right off the bat. We break them in slowly and get them built up to where they can do it. Because a lot of this is if we get them built up, they may stick around and work longer for the farm, and we may not be going through this as much.
And a lot of folks, I think, might be thinking about, well, gosh, that's an HR issue. But to have it framed in the context of legal liability issues, that may be a different perspective for some producers.
Exactly. And as I start off a lot of labor presentations with growers talk, and all producers talking about how many people have an HR department working on their farm, who does the HR? And I look at them and say, you're probably the HR department, so you have to understand how to deal with HR. You can't discipline employees now ways you might have done it 20 years ago. You got to pay attention to what you're doing to make sure you don't get people in trouble and you keep the operation going, because HR is the one thing that can screw up a lot of farms without thinking, like you just said, real quick.
Looking at you also mentioned the right to farm legislation. Could you give us just kind of a state of affairs across the industry in the different states where the poultry industry is most prevalent? How universal, uniform, or not are those various policies? How many states have them versus states of interest that don't?
Yeah, so they're in all 50 states, and they're all, as I point out to my students every year, they're all unique snowflakes. Each one's different, but they all do the same thing. So it really is sitting down and trying to figure out, and there really is no good way to kind of just describe each one without looking at a state law specifically, but working through and going to sites. The National Ag Law Center is a great resource where they're available online. You can pull them up by your state, you can look at them, and you can kind of figure out what requirements I need to think about, because in a lot of cases it really does require for folks to be in compliance with existing laws, permits, and not generally creating issues that could create the nuisance issues.
You mentioned nuisance issues, and certainly there have been a number of high-profile nuisance suits, not just in the poultry industry, poultry, swine, the animal agriculture industries writ large. How do you see that evolving here in the next year to 5 years? Do you anticipate with precedent that's on the books now, do you anticipate that becoming a larger issue for producers, or one that will just kind of continue to be what it is today, more or less?
I think it's going to continue to be what it is today. We've seen the high-profile ones, specifically in the hog industry, more in the southeast with a lot of that going on. I think we're going to continue to see it where groups look at how do we, utilize either how the law operates to our benefit and how can growers utilize it for their benefit. It's one of the things they talk to growers a lot about is understanding how the law operates so you can understand how it's best going to protect you and how it's not going to protect you. Because if you understand that, you can develop the operation around it and keep yourself in good standing to where you probably have that defense.
Some of these topics and the nuisance suits is one where I think producers have an awareness. It's been covered enough both by us in the trade press and the broader media at large. What are legal issues or potential challenges that you think the industry isn't paying enough attention to, that we need to have more conversation?
I think the biggest issue, and we're seeing it in Maryland a lot now too, is just the air quality issues from people making, looking at what's the air quality going on coming out of some of these bigger operations, and how do we go about, if there actually are problems, regulating it in a sense, if there is a problem from after testing's been done. So I think that's the biggest issue we've been looking at here lately, is just how do you handle these air quality issues that people are bringing up now.
And you see a legal liability exposure and a potential there as opposed to, say, more a perception issue, or does that just feed back into those nuisance lawsuit concerns?
Yeah, I think some, depending on the state, is going to feed into nuisance lawsuits. There'll be more push to bring lawsuits against those operations depending on the state. I think in states that are much more active in regulating, I think we're going to see much more push to put regulations in place and sort of develop processes within the permit as the stuff that has to be done.
Be a good conversation for the next time we get together to see how those continue to develop, and no doubt it'll be like you said about the right to farm laws. They'll all be special snowflakes. Each state will have its own, and that's always fun to deal with in these large operations that span multiple states.
Oh yeah, they're always fun to have to deal with and try to explain, like, you got to take this into account with every state you're working in. How do I do this? Because it's not always going to be one state fits all. You got to deal with all 50 states. And
great insights. Paul Goeringer is on the faculty at the University of Maryland dealing with ag law issues, one of the speakers here at the Midwest Poultry Convention. Stay tuned for all of our coverage of convention. You can find us at feedstuffs365.com. And if you're not already engaged with our social media platforms, I would encourage you to visit us via Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn as well. We'll have varying pieces of content there at all those sites as well. From Minneapolis for Feedstuffs, I'm Andy Vance reporting.